I'm talking to Martin Fisher about the thorny subject of communicating risks, opportunities, and uncertainties in projects. Martin is a knowledge manager who has been working for the last 10 years on a variety of projects, including most recently HS2. So, Martin, Ed Hoffman talked about the idea of normalizing deviance in his recent interview. A rather complex idea, but the idea that project team members identify potential issues that are not flagged on the risk radar, but because they don't have an immediate impact on the program, they tend to ignore them until the fateful day when one of these normalized deviances does have an impact and indeed causes catastrophic damage. So I thought that'd be an interesting point to start. Have you come across this idea?
Well, I can't lay my hands on any snappy examples, but I'm familiar with what he means. I can certainly see the sense in it. I guess a lot of what we'll be likely to come on to is about a tension between the wish to control and manage all aspects of a project, really, but certainly the communications and the information and the reporting, including the management of risk. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, having this wider awareness. And really, I think there's some value that we need to find in encouraging people to maintain an awareness that's wider than the immediate day job.
How do you go about that?
Well, it's obviously immediately people say, well, we have a day job and it's full enough, thanks very much, and there's a good reason, and we're always busy, we're always doing those things that need to be done. We haven't got time to sit around, checking Twitter or whatever it is. So I can see there's a tension there, but I think there are ways of building into what is your day job. Let's say, for argument's sake, there's a classic risk register that gets done at the beginning of a project. Well, is it something that gets done at the beginning and is never looked at again? Is there some scope for having in regular conversations and catch-ups a few minutes for what may be emerging risks? If we're in a situation where we're regularly updating progress and, to some extent what we're learning as we go along within a project, I would expect some of that to be identifying those risks so that, people have their radar on even whilst they're doing the immediate things that are in front of them. And some very simple tools, I think, could be helpful in this. For example, when I was at HS2 within the program management team that I was a part of, we used to have this very simple weekly update. Now, on the face of it, it's a bit of a chore. It's this document that everybody has to fill in every Friday afternoon. But it's a sort of thing where, if it's managed well, it's not overly onerous. It's simply a case of, many times, just ticking off your bullet points of what you've completed that week. But there was a built-in approach to it, which was fairly conversational. It was to say, things that are kind of on my radar. So I've noticed, you may be aware that this issue is cropping up in phase one. I've heard that they've got difficulties of ABC. And so these are the things that become part of the collective radar. And so it's in people's consciousness. I mean, it calls them under a lot of issues around just-in-time knowledge and the fact that the difficulty that people always say about knowledge is that it exists primarily in people's heads. So how do you respond to that? Do you therefore insist that everyone tries to write down as much as possible of what is in their heads? Or do you simply live with that and say, well, okay, how do we build in then, not just our written reports, but how do we build in opportunities where we share what's in our head? And that's simply a way of carrying on doing business. We accept that and we live with that as a reality.
That's interesting. I mean, I like the way you talk about the tension between control and management and this more informal understanding of what's going on. I guess that's true of communication as well, because project communications tend to be very single-minded. They're specific activities with a specific parameter and a purpose. So how do you take this more social aspect and add that to your communication as well?
I think you have to build in some element where there's a conversation going on. I don't consider myself an expert in the sort of nature and the psychology of teams, but classically there's a phase with any team when they're forming, and there's a phase where they're storming, and all these different aspects have to be acknowledged because there's value in them. If every project catch-up meeting, call, whatever, is simply a case of going down a checklist, have you completed this task, have you done this task, and there's no wiggle room and there's no wider conversational element, and it is very social consideration. Is this a team which is operating as a team so that it has a kind of life and an identity and a community of its own? Or is it just a number of people forced to be together at the same time to go down a checklist?
In other words, you need to focus on the human aspects, on the social aspects of the team and the team, how the team works together, as well as the technical.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, a lot of what people say about, office culture is that the most interesting conversations happen around the water cooler. It's a cliche, but it's so obviously true. And why is there the freedom for that to happen? It's sort of serendipitous. Oh, by the way, I saw so-and-so the other day, and I mentioned it. These things which come out of what is sometimes sadly seen as an unaffordable luxury of just that time and that space in which people can converse.
Looking at that idea of social learning, so people learning from each other, from their experience, from copying other people, and from what other people say. How is there a way in which the organisation can actually facilitate that, enable that? Should they be trying to record that? Should they just be letting it happen?
Unhelpfully, I'd say probably a bit of all of the above. I spoke about this idea of knowledge being in our heads. And so if we consider we have a collective project team head, then that's the sort of conversation space, and that's live and that's updated every day, and we simply move with that. And I think we have to accept to quite a large extent when the team has come and gone, that has passed and some of it will have never been captured, and we take that as acceptable collateral. There is, though, going to be value in curating some of that content, let's say, and in recording some of it. It does make me think about the skills of project management and the whole, if you like, art and science of project management, where it is very focused on achievement of tasks, and it develops templates and so on and structures and standardized way of doing things for very good reasons with very good intentions, but it ends up being very reductive. And it seems then that skills are promoted and encouraged and learned which are quite limited and don't include these sort of wider conversational social elements. So I think these are the kind of skills which need to be modelled and learned and practiced. And so, I've lived a lot of my working life in fear of the word process. It sort of strikes horror into me because, again, it's so reductive. But I actually looked up the definition of process the other day, and at its simplest is that it's simply a series of interrelated activities. So, the activity could be having a coffee with your teammates. I don't know, maybe you do go to the extent of putting that onto a flow chart. You shouldn't really need to teach these things, but my worry is that when you're teaching skills which are simply about, the completion of tasks, as your RAG status change from amber to red this month, and where it's quite, as I say, reductive. My worry is that subtlety gets lost, and the deviations that are external to the immediate risks on the register, for example, that you spoke about a minute ago, they do get ignored.
Brilliant. Let me close, Martin, by putting you on the spot somewhat. If you were given a greenfield project site and you were starting from scratch, where would you start in terms of designing learning into the project or into the project organisation?
Great question. Well, based on especially some of my recent experience, unashamedly from a knowledge manager's point of view, I would say this, wouldn't I? Considerations of knowledge, and to a large part even really information, don't figure at the kind of kicking off strategic level. So what I mean is, obviously everyone takes notice of what the executives say and what's in the various strategies. It seems that, though, coming along in the case of HS2 several years later to try to bring about some knowledge management capability, was continually playing catch up, and seemed to be always a case that I was identifying existing quite thickly drawn functional lines and identifying between those lines. It's this sort of grey space where the knowledge resides, and where I think the considerations about knowledge sharing need to be made, which aren't. And the need I saw was to be joining up a lot of these functions, which apparently are not speaking to each other. So there had been no contact and collaboration between a knowledge function and a learning and development function per se, or between the knowledge function and the IT function. I mean, that's traditionally a better relationship. It's a bit more obvious. But then go back to that triangle. Well, what connections and sharing has there been between the learning and development function and the IT function? These services exist on their own, and they operate largely on a kind of you get what you're given basis in terms of IT and perhaps in terms of learning and development. And then the knowledge function seems to always be the one that's joining them up. So back to what we said a moment ago about training especially, and you're asking about learning and skills development. I think it's a question, again, I'm banging the same drum, of building in time to allow people to develop those skills and to work as teams and develop the team ethic, if you like. So, I'd be looking at regular built-in time for developing those sort of face-to-face skills. And I think back to some of the organisations I've worked in, where one of them, which was my first knowledge management role, it was an organisation of around 70 people, and one day every month, everybody got together face-to-face. That's a difficult thing to pull off. But it was quite tremendous, and in those days, you can deal with the boring things like people having their laptops updated, but you can also have good length, free-ranging conversations where people are updating one another. And so, this radar is shared. The collective head is kind of catches up with itself. That some of those risks we spoke about at the beginning might be more easily identified and understood. So I would have built-in learning time. I would have built-in time simply for a more social interaction, and I would definitely have better connections between a lot of these classic organisation or program and project steering functions, such as IT, learning and development. At HS2 as an example, I'm sure no one would mind my saying it, there's so many strategies, but so little thought seems to have gone into actually connecting them or where they have common ground.
Thank you, Martin. That's tremendous. I really enjoyed the conversation.